and welcome to the tutorial on exclusionary reasons. My name is Mahalia Baldini. I'm the Adult Education and Literacy Program Supervisor here at the Texas Workforce Commission. I'm so glad that you joined us. This will not take long. I'm going to try to keep this as concise as possible. So let's go ahead and get started with learning a little bit more about exclusionary reasons. The objectives of today's tutorial are pretty simple. I'm going to talk a little bit about what exclusionary reasons are. I'm going to talk about when they're really necessary. I'm going to talk about how long you guys there in the field have to really make a determination of if an exclusionary reason is both needed and necessary. We're going to talk about how the use of the exclusionary reason can help with your exit-based performance measures. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about how do you really enter this information into teams to make sure that you are getting this exclusion captured appropriately and reported appropriately. So to get us started, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on what exclusionary reasons are and what is really their purpose. And generally, their purpose is to take exited students and exclude them from your exit-based performance. And the reason for that is you are basically identifying that the student is not able and will not be able to meet those requirements because of these specific reasons. Now, these are not TWC developed reasons. These actually come down through our federal partners, and they are exclusively written out for us. So don't think this is something sort of TWC is developing. These are things explicitly that, the feds have basically decided that these are good reasons why we would want to exclude someone from these exit-based measures. So I want to go over them, and hopefully they'll make a lot of sense to you. If you think about it in the context of these are reasons why a person can't work or can't go to classes, post-secondary education, they wouldn't enroll in college if they fell into one of these circumstances. So the first one is that the individual has become incarcerated in a correctional facility, or that they've become a resident of a facility that's really providing a 24-hour support for that person. It could be a hospital or a treatment center during the course of receiving services, right? So we're talking about an individual who at the start of the program year or the program entry with us, they may have been attending a brick and mortar class. They may have signed up for a distance learning option. They may have been taking some remote learning options with us, but at some point in the course of their participation, these circumstances have happened and they have went to jail, they have went to prison, they have had to mandate themselves into a 24-hour treatment facility. If that is a circumstance that this participant comes across, you want to make sure that you're documenting that for that reason. The second one is a medical treatment, and that one's pretty cut and dry. So if they are receiving a medical treatment that's really expected to last longer than 90 days and is basically going to prevent that individual from entering into employment, entering into post-secondary education, going to college classes, things like that, because they are in a medical treatment, that would be a reason why you would want to make sure to enter this into teams. Obviously, if the person has deceased, and the last bullet there, which is the participant is a member of the National Guard or some other military reserve, and they're being called to active duty, and that active duty is expected to last for longer than 90 days. And I know some of you have students, because I've gotten those calls, where they do have students that are being called up and they're going to be going into an active duty status. That's a good opportunity to make sure that you are supporting your performance outcomes by excluding that individual. Here at the bottom, I have included some other exclusionary reasons, and I separated these out because I want to make sure that I make a distinction between someone who is incarcerated at program entry, and for those of you who are doing correctional education, meaning you're going into jails, into prisons, and you're providing correctional education at the point of entry that the person comes into the program, they're already in that situation. That is defined a little bit differently, and you want to make sure that that's the selection that you place and that you report to us. The last one here is foster care. And we serve a lot of youth here in Texas, and we serve a lot of individuals that are 18 or below. And if you do have a person that is attending services and attending classes with you, and they come into a situation where they're going to be going into foster care, and that is going to be able to enable them to come to class or to continue with their services, you want to make sure that you report that to us. So let's talk a little bit about when an exclusion is necessary. This here is a crosswalk that I developed that hopefully will help you guys. The first column here is going to be the team's terms, and that's what we're going to be looking at a little bit later today in terms of what and how do you document this into the data system. The middle column is the exclusionary reason. This is more of the federal definition for that particular item. And then the last is kind of layman's terms, right? Just an explanation to help you with local training and getting staff more familiar with the nuances of each of these. So I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of different rows here. I want to talk about the first row, which is became institutionalized, and the last row, which is a current criminal offender. I started this conversation on the last slide. I want to continue it here. We tried to, at least in the teams, in terms of the data entry perspective, and to help you guys with local training, we kind of named these things very differently so that hopefully it will help you to make that determination locally and report it accurately. So the first row here, which is became institutionalized, again, that's somebody that at the point of time and program entry, they were not in a offender status. They come in, they may have been an ex-offender, but they weren't currently in a jail, they weren't currently in prison, they weren't currently in any sort of institution. So they have the capability, at least at program entry, to go to work, to go to school, to do what they needed to do. But then circumstances changed. And during the course of their period of participation, they do go to jail or go to prison or go into a 24-hour treatment facility, maybe for drug and alcohol or something like that. Then you would want to say that this person became institutionalized. The last row, again, is going to be people that if you are providing correction education and at the time of program entry, that individual is considered an offender and is currently incarcerated in jail or prison, you would want to make sure that when that individual stops their services with you, that you would put this exclusionary reason in for those individuals. Okay, a funding code is not going to save you for this. So I know that we have a funding code in Teams, that we've used it for years and years to kind of identify individuals that are participating in corrections education. But in terms of your performance, it's not going to take them out of the denominator when they stop receiving services for these exit-based measures. So that's just an important thing to kind of make a note of. So funding codes are not going to save you. So let's talk about staff determination, because this is what's going to ultimately save you and hopefully help you with your performance measures. When you're training staff locally, and many of you utilize career navigators for follow-up, we've recently put out some additional funding for staff for follow-up. But when you're talking about making a local determination for this, there's a couple of things, key things that you need to be aware of. The first one is that this must be recorded in Teams prior to the 90-day exit. So what does that really mean? What it means is that you have a window of time. You have a window of time from the last service date plus 90 days to make a determination on whether or not an exclusionary reason is necessary or needed for an individual. So if you're utilizing the POP report, which I think many of you are, for outreach or follow-up activities, and you're pulling that POP report and you notice that a person's not been in class for 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, 40 days, whatever service date, plus 90 days, to make a determination on whether or not an exclusionary reason is necessary or needed for an individual. So if you're utilizing the POP report, which I think many of you are, for outreach or follow-up activities, and you're pulling that POP report and you notice that a person's not been in class for 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, 40 days, whatever that time period is, and you are making efforts to reach out to that individual to try to determine why they are absent from class. And through that process, you find out that one of the reasons that they have may align to an exclusionary reason. We want to make sure that we are putting that and that you have a local process and a local procedure in place for those staff to kind of, let them know, like, oh yeah, if it's for one of these reasons, the next step is to be able to go into Teams and report that back into the system, because it's an important feature and it can help you with your performance. So again, the start date of the exclusionary reason must be later than the last service date. So if an individual, and in this circumstance you see on your screen, if their last service date was 6/10/2019, then the earliest you would be able to enter an exclusionary reason would start 6/11. And the reason for that, and it's pretty, it makes a lot of sense if you really think about it. If the point of the exclusionary reason is to say this is the reason why the student is no longer coming to class, and is no longer participating in our services, you wouldn't want to enter that and make that proclamation basically on a date where they had services, because there's an intent behind each of these circumstances, and the intent is that they are unable to come to class. They are unable to go to work. They are unable to participate. That's kind of the important outlier there. And really what all of you guys want to know is, well, if I'm doing all of this, what's in it for us? And I completely understand that. So how does this really help with your performance? So let's talk a little bit about that. So when you go into Teams, you enter this exclusionary reason, you're doing all this great follow-up, you're getting that information in there. What is it really going to help? So you have 3 exit-based performance measures. Every single exiter in our program falls into 2 of these measures, which is the employment enrolled quarter 2 and the employment enrolled quarter 3 and 4. Some individuals, if they meet the qualifications, may fall into the credential rate as well. But everybody falls into your employment enrolled measure. So it's a very important aspect and gives you an opportunity to have some influence over your performance if you utilize this correctly. Because basically what it does is it takes those exiters, and if you have identified that one of these exiters is has an exclusionary reason for why they can't go to work and why they can't be enrolled in post-secondary education, you're going to remove them from the denominator altogether. Same for the credential rate. So when you enter the exclusionary reason, if that particular individual falls into the denominator for those measures, then it's going to remove them. So it's kind of like they're not in there anymore. So that's going to help you with some of these exit-based measures. Now, I want to make a note that there's nothing you can do that's going to exclude someone from a measurable skills gain. Corrections education, ESL, HSE, IET, every single student that gets to that 12 hours and is considered a participant is going to be in an MSG measure. There's no way around it. There's no exclusion for that. But you do have this flexibility for those individuals that are unable to meet the requirement for employment. to exclude those from your denominator. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about what's in this for me and how important is this, because it can make a good and a lasting impact to your performance in a positive way. So I want to talk about how do you really get to the place where you're entering this information into Teams. What does it look like? We tried to make this as simple a process as we could, and it's something that you're going to find in your regular data entry. Your staff are probably already seeing it. They may be asking questions like, what does this mean? What does this feature do? So I wanted to give you just some really quick, high-level, how do you get this in the system? Because until it goes into Teams, as you guys know, it doesn't exist. So when you're entering something, when you're entering an exclusionary reason in Teams, the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the person has not exited. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. You can do this by going to the participant record, you pull it up, and under period of participation header on the participant record, you're going to look at the exiter flag column, and if it says no, then you know that the person has not yet reached exiter status, and you are in the window to be able to enter an exclusionary reason. Another really great tool is the period of participation report. If you pull up a POP report, it's going to give you a countdown of the number of days since the last date of service. So if you know that the student's been like, I'm not coming back, or maybe the student is at that 5, 10, 15, 20 day mark where they've just been absent from the program and you are considering them to be a leaver, and they have left the program and you are doing follow-up, that's a good resource and a good tool to use and reach out to those individuals and say, hey, why did you leave the program? But that's the window of opportunity that you need to look for. So you're looking for someone who really has a last date of service. It looks like they're not intending to come back, and then you have 90 days before that exit flag turns to yes to be able to enter in this exclusionary reason. So the physical aspects in Teams of literally being able to enter this is very simple. You're going to click on the blue hyperlink in the last column. When you click on the blue hyperlink, you're going to see a form that gets displayed. When the form pops up, you want to edit and you want to fill the form out. It's just a couple of really simple things that you need to fill out in the form, and then you want to make sure, of course, that you save it. When you click that edit button, here are the steps that you're going to want to follow. The first one is you're going to want to select the appropriate exclusionary reason from the drop-down. You can see here that they're all listed. You're going to enter a start date, and again, that start date has to be past the last service date, so at least 1 day past the last service date. When you enter the start date, the end date is going to automatically populate. I know here it says you can enter the end date. Just know you can go in and manipulate the end date, but it's going to automatically populate to 90 days. So just FYI for that. And then the last thing is you're going to choose an acceptable source of documentation. I'm going to show you and go over what those are, but you're going to choose that from the drop-down. The last option on the page is the ability to upload the documentation file into Teams. Now this is optional. We don't require it, but we do require that you keep the source documentation in the student file. If you're like me, I'm a both person. I want to put it in Teams and I want to keep it in the student file. I mean, you never know. So that's totally up to you guys, and it is an optional field. Once you've completed your exclusionary reason, this is what it's going to look like in Teams once it's completed. So where there was a no little blue hyperlink before, now you're going to have whatever information that you have included on the form and saved. So you can see here that the exclusionary reason is health or medical. The start date for this was 7/15, which if you compare that back to the last service date that's indicated here, you can see that the start date for the exclusionary reason is past the last service date. And then there is an automatic end date here that's been calculated, 9/8. And then whatever the source documentation is, which is the withdrawal form form with an explanation. That was the source documentation that this individual utilized when they filled this out in Teams. Now, when we're talking about acceptable source documentation and you're filling out this form, let's go over the options that you're going to have available to you, because you will have local flexibility. You may want to restrict it to something very specific, or at a minimum, you're going to want to include in your process the ability to collect any of these things to add to have as your source documentation. The first one is file documentation with notes from program staff. That's the easiest one, right? You call somebody up on the phone, you have follow-up staff, maybe it's a career navigator, whoever's doing that outreach and follow-up role for you guys. And during the course of this, you have found out that the individual meets one of these circumstances, and you want to be able to document it. You can do that through case notes. You can do that on an Excel spreadsheet. In terms of follow-up services that you guys are doing, make sure that those notes are somewhere that if a monitor comes, that they can pull them up and you can basically have that documentation available. I suggest putting it in the student file, but at a minimum, all of these source documentation needs to be available for monitors. The second one is information from partner services. That could be if you have a partner that you're working with and they send you information and they have already verified that the person qualifies for one of the exclusionary reasons. That could be the documentation that you use. WIA status or exit forms, that's primarily for people that are co-enrolled in the board. They have their own process for Title I in terms of excluding people. So if they have provided you with something through that partnership, you could utilize that. Electronic records, that would be any electronic record that you are getting either from a treatment facility or a correctional institution or possibly, a funeral home or a family member or something like that. Withdrawal form with explanation is the next one here, and that is if you have a local process to have a student officially withdraw from the program, you have them sign a form. You could do that, put that in the file. And then information from institution or facility, again, that's just another option for going back and getting documentation from an actual institution. Those are sometimes hard to come by. And one thing I'll say on both that one and some of the electronic records, you want to make sure that your release of information or your confidentiality statement that your students are signing cover the ability, for you to ask for these things and that you have some sort of permission from the student. This is very sensitive information. You want to be very aware of that and very sensitive to that. So you want to make sure that you have student information before you go asking around for people to submit documents to you that may contain that. So those are the acceptable source documentations. Again, I think most of you probably will use just the notes from program staff that are going to detail out how you came about the knowledge that the person meets this exclusionary reason, but there are other options available there. So that's really all that I have. I wanted to give you guys an opportunity, if you do have questions, that you can follow up here with us at alta@twc.state.tx.us. I thank you so much for joining me today, and hopefully you learned a little bit. But if you need more information, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will see you next time.